everyone, and welcome to my review of Julie Taymor's adaptation of Shakespeare's classic, The Tempest. Now, for those not in the know, I think that first sentence should have given it away, but this is a modern filmic adaptation of Shakespeare's classic, and before I do go any further in this review, I want to say I have yet to read The Tempest. I know, crucify me please, it's a terrible thing, but I will say it's not because I'm an uncultured oaf or anything like that. It's largely just one of the things I've actually never gotten around to read at this point. I've read many of his other plays and works, but it's just one I never got to, either through my own personal leisure reading or through any of the classes I've taken throughout university. That said, I think this work should stand on its own, even if it's an adaptation. The original master who wrote this, some of the resonance that he put in the story should show through in this adaptation. And on that, I think this movie, it's okay. Now, I know, you know what, honestly, I guess this is a good break in my previous couple of reviews where I've just been kind of praising things constantly, but I think this movie is a really mixed bag, and that's really indicative of Julie Taymor's career. Julie Taymor, if you don't know, is a stage director turned film director. Most notable works include Across the Universe and Titus. Now, both, they have a really weird sense of visual style, particularly Across the Universe. Well, you know what, Titus too, I suppose. But irregardless, my point being that there's a really interesting visual style that Julie Taymor has been able to work with, but her adaptations and her stories at all just tend to frustrate me. Parts of them I love and parts of them I hate. Across the Universe, I loved everything in the first half, up to the point that they go to Vietnam, and it kind of slowed down the second half, and the musical numbers really weren't that exciting anymore. I wasn't too miffed by the different covers of the Beatles songs. I thought they did pretty well most of the time. But again, while the visual styling worked really well in the first half even, in the second half it just didn't seem as appropriate. Not to mention some really bad misfires. I'm thinking of Skelter there. But Titus as well, too. I enjoy the story of Titus. Again, actually one of the ones I have never read, at least until I saw that movie and I read it afterwards. And I was very impressed with the way she had handled parts of it, but honestly it just wore out its welcome. It was way too long, and it just seemed not necessarily miscast, but the material seemed a little misjudged. I didn't know exactly what kind of tone it was going for. I appreciated the visual stylings and the modernization of the plot itself, but it just didn't do it for me, suffice to say. And getting to The Tempest, finally, I know, it's pretty much the same kind of thing. I really like the environment that they shot on here. Really barren, stark contrast, especially the fact that, again, very dense visual style here is replicated in this movie. All the effects are very either complex or very intricate in some way, and while some may think it's jarring, I think it's kind of a nice contrast to the environment that they're in, particularly in that it kind of accentuates the magic as it actually is. But in this case, I mean film magic, really. It accentuates the feeling of these plot devices, particularly of Ariel. I think they did a really good job portraying him, for the most part. A little bit hit or miss on kind of flying away effects, but let's get to that in a minute. First off, I got to talk about the story itself. But like I said, I've never read the original. I cannot comment extensively on it. I really only know the basics. From what I understand, and what I want to relate back, is that Helen Mirren, ostensibly the main character in this movie, although this is really, you know, a character piece, many other characters involved, with all plays in Shakespeare in particular, but irregardless, I enjoyed the story here, and I think I enjoyed the concept of the story a lot more than I enjoyed the execution of the story. I really enjoyed the Prospera's plight, so to speak, her kind of character arc, while a little too subtle in the middle, I think works out, and leads to an actually rather surprising ending, considering a lot of Shakespeare's other works. Not spoiling anything, so I won't say much about it, but suffice to say, it's surprising and unfortunately a little abrupt. But other than that, I think it's handled fairly well. There's really about three main plot threads. One with kind of shipwrecked buffoons, shipwrecked royalty, and then Prospera and her immediate family, and so on and so on. Now, it's interesting how they all coalesce and converge on each other near the later part of the film, and I like a lot of the people in the stories themselves. I think Alan Cumming, fantastic job as always. Again, actors' names, not character names. Russell Brand and Alfred Molina as the buffoons. A lot of them say they're miscast, and perhaps so, but I think they pulled it off rather nicely. Again, I can't comment on the validity and, frankly, if it played well against the book, but that's what I thought. Helen Mirren, fantastic. I mean, Prospero does a fantastic job. He chews the scenery, but it's expected, this kind of thing. A lot of people say that the tone is really over the top in this, and it's true, but at the same time, a lot of Shakespeare's works, I'm not saying are bereft of subtlety, far from it, but at the same time, if they're undergoing modernization, or for an audience that's not necessarily familiar with these kinds of things, I think playing it in a more operatic way actually helps the story. It brings out a lot of the more latent emotions that might be buried beneath the frankly somewhat archaic language that people might not be used to, likely aren't used to, other than maybe the occasional reading of Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet in high school. That said, it's up for debate whether it necessarily should need to be modernized or not, but they do keep the original Shakespearean language, if you're wondering here. It's a good job of preserving it. I'll get to more of that in a little bit, though, when I get to the sound portion of this review. But overall, I think the story is pretty decent. I mean, it's Shakespeare. It's a good story. Just execution is what I'm saying. The ending is a little abrupt. The pacing is a little sluggish right at the beginning. You see a couple of events that are very interesting, and it kind of slows down for a little bit, and once the buffoons are introduced, it starts to take off, I think. Particularly when Stefano's entrance into the movie is fantastic, but Alfred Molina's character. Once that starts happening and all of the rest of the characters start really the main plot, it does pick up pace. And one thing I really did enjoy about this movie is that it was fairly succinct. This is less than 2 hours, and while I would have liked it to go maybe at least 2 hours, because it's close enough that it could have benefited, it wouldn't have overstayed its welcome, I don't think, after just adding that little bit more. But overall, honestly, it was a decent execution. Just has a few pacing problems. One thing I guess it can't be avoided talking about is the effects in this movie. Like I said, they're very complex. Some may say overdone. I would say yes, but at the same time, again, I like the contrast between the environment. It's very stark, very plain, and the effects, which are incredibly bombastic. They're a little bit hit or miss as far as actual quality of animation, but overall I think they definitely hit the visual marks very well. Also, I think, and this is again part of me not understanding understanding the original as well, a lot of the prose in Shakespeare was turned into kind of these songs that they've done throughout, and they're not overdone. And I actually like them, to be honest, but the one problem I had, and I really need to reference this, is that I don't know whether it was the copy I watched or not, but honestly it was very hard to understand some of the language here. And I'm not talking from a strictly linguistic perspective, I didn't understand that word. I'm saying I could not hear them. The sound mixing was very off, I thought. Particularly Dijuan Hansu was very difficult with his accent on top of the music playing, and this is what brought it to mind, these songs here. Great songs, fantastic, at least fantastic songs itself. It's very well sung, but I could not understand a lot of the lyrics, and I'm not going to fault Julie Taymor for this, but at the same time, it's still her movie. I've got to mention it, whether it's her fault or the sound mixer's fault. I don't know, but it's definitely an important thing to note, and said modernization I think is really hampered by that, because even though that they use the same language, I think it's still very understandable. But at the same time, you know, if you can't hear the dialogue at all, it's going to be very difficult for people, especially not used to this kind of language or delivery, because the delivery is very classical. Despite this being a film adaptation, it's staged a lot like a play in many cases, which is understandable to an extent, of course, and I think they do a good job of opening it up, but at the same time, much of it is just dialogue exchanges, and when some of that dialogue is drowned out, there you have it. Overall, I think The Tempest is a good movie. It's probably Julie Taymor's a better effort than Julie Taymor's Titus. Honestly, I did not like Titus. Anthony Hopkins did a good job. I know tons of people love Titus. I'm going to get probably showered with comments, yeah right, and about how people just hated this movie and loved Titus, but honestly, for my sensibilities, this one worked a little better. There was probably a better story, better flow, better pacing in Titus, at least for like the first 2 hours. But The Tempest, I thought, just worked a little better. I think it could have used a little tightening, but overall, if you like Shakespeare, if you like fantasy movies and don't mind the archaic language, there's some really cool stuff to be seen here. It's a decent plot, fairly good execution, and it's probably one of the few times you're going to see The Tempest actually done in any significant fashion. I've been looking through previous adaptations, and there's really not a whole lot. There's one or two, but honestly, most of them are fairly low budget. The only one that even comes close is kind of a loose adaptation, Forbidden Planet, which I also haven't seen. Wow, I am just confessing a lot in this review. Irregardless, check out The Tempest, I think. It's interesting, not the best movie you ever see. Perhaps a disappointment from the really weird and enticing trailer, but it's definitely worth a watch.